Madison Lowe didn't move into the old carpenter's house for peace or reinvention. She wasn't chasing a fresh start, or looking to reconnect with her roots, or whatever else people usually said when they turned their lives upside down. She moved because the house was left to her. No mortgage, no rent. After 20 years of teaching at the same underfunded high school where the hallways always smelled like dust and despair, where administrators swapped out year after year like light bulbs but nothing ever changed, and after 2 solid decades of tight budgeting and quiet dinners eaten at a chipped kitchen table, Madison had finally gotten something that didn't come with a bill stapled to it. When her uncle passed away, a solitary man who mostly kept to himself and built furniture in a cluttered workshop behind the house, he left her the property in full. No strings, no squabbling heirs. Just a letter, folded neatly inside the title transfer packet, with a few shaky words in his careful, all-caps handwriting. You'll put it to good use. Just keep the doors closed after dark. She hadn't thought much of that last sentence at the time. Her uncle had been quirky and possibly a little paranoid in his later years, convinced that everything from zoning committees to leaf blower manufacturers had secret agendas. Madison chalked it up to his usual eccentricity and focused instead on logistics. The house was old but sturdy. 2 stories of practical wood and weathered siding, with a long porch that wrapped around the front like a thoughtful hug. A mature oak shaded the yard. The grass had grown tall but still held its shape. A row of trimmed bushes lined the front. Boxwood, she thought, though she wasn't sure, and there was even a hot tub, albeit one that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Bush administration. But it worked. Madison, being Madison, cleaned it herself, spending one quiet Sunday scrubbing the grime out of the filters and refilling it bucket by bucket. She'd never owned anything like that before. She wasn't even the type who dreamed about jacuzzis. But it was already there, and it was hers, and it was strange and wonderful to sit in bubbling water at night, staring up through the branches of the oak tree into a sky with no streetlights or sirens. The neighborhood was different. She'd read online that the area was close-knit, which in Madison's experience usually translated to nosy. She wasn't wrong. Her second morning in the house, a woman appeared on her porch unannounced, holding a box of supermarket cupcakes and wearing a silk floral robe that clung too tightly to her hips. She had a platinum blonde helmet of hair that didn't move when she turned her head and a smile that felt a few degrees too forced. "You must be Madison," she chirped. "I'm Karen. I live 3 doors down. Technically 4 if you count the rental, but that's always up in the air." Madison nodded politely, opening the screen door just enough to take the box. "Thanks. That's kind of you." "Oh, it's nothing. I just wanted to welcome you properly. This porch has such good energy. You know, your uncle used to let us gather out here. Little neighborhood chats, sunset tea, that kind of thing. He was so open-minded. We all miss him." Madison blinked. "I wasn't aware he hosted anything." "He didn't mention it." Karen laughed lightly and waved a hand, dismissing the notion. "Oh, it wasn't formal? Just a thing that kind of grew naturally. People used to come by, sit out here after dinner, talk about their day. He was always happy to let us. I assumed you'd be keeping the tradition alive." Madison felt a small warning bell go off somewhere deep in her chest. She'd never been fond of uninvited familiarity, especially not in her own home. Still, she kept her tone neutral. "I'll be spending most evenings inside, but I appreciate you stopping by." Karen tilted her head slightly, smile still fixed. Of course. Everyone's different." Her eyes flicked to the cleaned hot tub in the corner of the porch. "Glad to see you got the spa working again. The thing's been dry since the Obama years." "I gave it a deep clean." Karen grinned wider. "Well, if you ever feel like sharing, my lower back isn't what it used to be. I've got 2 grandkids staying over this summer. The little darlings get bored easily. Water's always a hit." Madison's smile cooled. "It's a private amenity." "Oh, I get it. But technically, porches count as common frontage under the local improvement plan. There was some kind of inclusion act passed last year. Community development, green zones, shared wellness. All very progressive. You might want to look into it. Madison stared at her, unsure if she was joking. It's my porch. It's on the deed. Karen lifted one shoulder. Sure, I'm just saying. People around here like to feel welcome. This house always had a certain openness. We wouldn't want anyone to think you were closing the doors on the community. With that, she turned and walked off, slippers brushing the concrete with a soft, entitled whisper. Madison stood for a long moment in the doorway, cupcakes in one hand, wondering if what had just happened was a conversation, a performance, or a veiled threat. Maybe all three. She closed the screen, set the cupcakes on the counter without opening them, and tried to shake off the interaction. But it lingered. In the following days, she noticed small things. A pair of lawn chairs appeared on the edge of the yard near the oak tree. Old, faded, but positioned just so, angled toward her porch. A paperback novel sat on the top step one morning, a folded receipt marking someone's place halfway through. The backyard gate, which she distinctly remembered closing, was open one evening when she came home from the store. At first, she considered the usual rational explanations. Maybe a breeze, maybe a delivery guy, but too many maybes started piling up, and Madison wasn't a fool. She wasn't paranoid either. She was precise. It's why she'd lasted so long in education without burning out completely. She knew when rules were being stretched, and she knew the difference between hospitality and encroachment. Still, she didn't make a scene. She simply bought a new padlock for the gate and installed a motion sensor light on the porch. It wasn't meant to scare anyone, just a boundary, quietly enforced, an invisible fence for invisible lines. The next morning, the motion sensor light was turned backward, facing the house instead of the yard. Madison stared at it for a long time, her coffee growing cold in her hand. It would have taken a screwdriver and a ladder. Someone had to deliberately go out of their way, not just to disable it, but to send a message. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't post about it or call the police. She simply rotated it back, tightened the screws, and added a second light above the hot tub. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood like a soft gray blanket, Madison sat on the porch with her laptop and a glass of water, reading quietly. She didn't react when she saw Karen pass by on the sidewalk, pausing just long enough to glance up at the tub, her expression unreadable. Madison didn't wave. She didn't nod. She let silence do the talking. But she felt it in her bones. The way some people know when weather is about to change, that this wasn't over. Not even close. Madison didn't immediately react when things began to shift. She was the type to observe before accusing, to gather evidence instead of chasing ghosts. But even her measured temperament had its limits. It began with a plastic lawn chair appearing beside the hot tub, one she didn't own. It was weathered, pale green, positioned perfectly under the shadow of the porch awning, with a rolled towel draped neatly over the armrest. She didn't remove it right away. Instead, she left it there, watched it for a day, then moved it around the side of the house. The next time she looked, it was back. Same spot, same angle. That's when she knew. Someone wasn't just crossing a line. They were drawing one. A small, subtle claim planted in her space. There was no note, no neighborly introduction attached. But she knew who it was. There wasn't anyone else with that specific combination of arrogance, entitlement, and performance. Karen's earlier warning disguised as a chat had only scratched the surface. This was the next move in a game Madison hadn't agreed to play. When she stepped onto the porch the next morning, a laminated notice had been zip-tied to the railing near the steps. Bold black text on glossy white. Community Wellness Zone. Open access. Respect shared resources. Relax. Reconnect. A cheerful green leaf was printed in the corner like a seal of approval. At first glance, it might have looked official, even progressive. But Madison had seen enough bureaucratic paperwork in her lifetime to know the real thing. This wasn't it. There was no city insignia, no issuing department, no ordinance number. Just a vague, self-appointed declaration taped to her own railing without permission. She tore it down, brought it inside, and stared at it on her kitchen counter. The wording wasn't random. Someone had spent time on it. It had the cadence of something prepared, as if it had been copied from a template. Or worse, used before. She didn't call the police. She didn't rant online. She opened her laptop and started calling city offices, zoning boards, neighborhood services, any entity remotely related to land use or residential codes. No one knew anything about a community wellness zone. A few clerks laughed and suggested it sounded like a yoga retreat or a mental health brochure. No department had records of any designations involving her address. Nothing in planning. Nothing in parks. One woman suggested she keep records of any further incidents and wished her luck in a tone that carried too much experience to be comforting. Madison saved that sign in a drawer. Not as evidence. As a reminder. The hot tub, which had become a small but reliable part of her routine, suddenly felt exposed. She stopped using it. Every time she looked at it now, it looked back. She didn't trust it. Not with chairs appearing and strangers feeling welcome enough to install signage. The final push came when she stepped out to water the front garden and found a beach towel folded over the porch swing, still damp, and a bottle of coconut-scented sunscreen wedged behind one of the cushions. It wasn't hers. She checked the cap. Open, used, whoever left it had been comfortable enough to lounge, soak up sun, and reapply. She scanned the street, slow and deliberate. No one was watching. No one ever was. Not directly. That was what made it worse. The following day, the hot tub was occupied. She didn't hear music or conversation or even the telltale churn of water. She opened the front door and simply saw her there. Karen. Reclined, arms resting on the ledges, a wide-brimmed straw hat perched atop her head, the steam rising gently around her like something out of a brochure. Her eyes were closed, her legs stretched comfortably. A glass of lemonade, complete with lemon slice, sat beside her on the corner of the tub. When Madison stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked, not loud, but enough. Karen opened one eye, blinked slowly, then smiled like she'd been waiting. "I hope you don't mind. The jets are a godsend for circulation. You really ought to take advantage of it more often. It's such a shame to let a wellness zone go unused." Madison didn't answer right away. She stood still, absorbing the scene, letting the absurdity settle into rage. "Get out!" Karen tilted her head. "I'm not harming anything. I even brought my own towel." "You're trespassing. This is private property." Karen's voice didn't rise. "It's part of the open access agreement. We discussed it at the last community forum. You weren't there." "There is no forum. There is no agreement. You're in my tub." Karen stood slowly, water cascading from her robe. She moved without shame, without urgency, like she owned the place. "Your uncle never would have reacted like this. He understood how this community works. He was generous." "My uncle is dead," Madison said coldly, "and you're not entitled to anything on this property." Karen gathered her things without flinching. "That may be your opinion, but shared spaces have long-standing precedent in this area. If you'd done your research, you might have known that before trying to isolate yourself. That attitude tends to turn people against you." She walked past Madison with that same detached composure she'd used the first time they met, like she was the reasonable one, the patient one, and Madison was the uptight newcomer stirring trouble. When she was gone, Madison locked the door behind her, not because she was afraid, but because it was a declaration. She wouldn't let anyone define the rules on her property, not with signs, not with speeches, and not with sun hats and lemonade. Later, when she checked the side gate, she found the latch had been taped open. A simple strip of duct tape folded under itself, just enough to keep it from locking. She peeled it off, jaw tightening. That wasn't coincidence. That was preparation. She replaced the latch, reinforced it, then took a quiet walk around the property's perimeter. Her uncle had done good work on the fencing. The posts were solid, the boards tight. But she started noticing little disturbances. Pebbles displaced along the edges, grass worn in a narrow line near the porch, as if someone had paced the same route more than once. It didn't feel random. It felt studied, like someone had been walking the border, checking entry points, seeing where the house breathed. That night she sat down and printed her property survey, highlighting the dimensions in red. She began drafting a letter, not to any government office, but to an attorney. Not to file anything yet, but to understand her options. She knew better than to wait until something went wrong, and things were already wrong. Karen hadn't just dipped a toe over the line, she'd dragged a chair, brought a drink, and stayed long enough to feel entitled. Madison didn't want revenge. She wanted her lines back. Not imaginary ones. Real ones. The kind that meant something. The kind no one could pretend weren't there. Madison knew, even before she opened the door, that something had changed again. It was a subtle shift, the kind you don't see but feel. In the way silence lingers longer than it should, in the way light falls on familiar surfaces differently, as if watching you back. She stepped outside with a folder tucked under one arm and her keys in hand, prepared to drive to the county clerk's office, where she planned to request an updated boundary verification. Not because she needed it. She had the deed, the survey, and the records, but because she wanted it stamped, fresh, recent, ready to be presented if Karen dared try anything again. It was a preventative measure. A quiet escalation, legal and clean. But as she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she stopped. Someone had chalked a line across the sidewalk, a curved arc that swept from one edge of her lawn to the other. Inside the arc, in pale blue letters, were the words, Community Relief Sector. Madison stared down at it for a long time, not because it surprised her, but because of how methodical it was. Someone had taken time to center it. The handwriting was neat, confident. The curve of the chalk matched the property line closely. Too closely. Whoever drew it had knowledge of her layout, and that made the message far more deliberate than a random act of neighborhood whimsy. The chalk wouldn't last, of course. The first rain would wash it away, and she could scrub it off herself before then if she chose. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't about permanence. It was about visibility. About optics. It was graffiti designed to look like civic pride. That made it more dangerous. It wasn't just Karen acting alone anymore. This was a coordinated gesture, meant to test her patience and posture. Madison crouched, took a picture of the sidewalk, and emailed it to her attorney with a short caption. This was not here yesterday. She stood slowly, turned toward the porch, and froze. The hot tub cover had been removed again, neatly, folded in half and set against the railing like someone cared for it. Inside the tub, the water was still, but not undisturbed. A floating plastic lily pad sat at the center with a tea light candle balanced in the middle. It wasn't lit, but it was new. No wind could have placed it there. Madison walked up to it, leaned forward, and picked it out with 2 fingers. It smelled faintly of lavender. She dropped it into a plastic bag and added it to the drawer with the sign. Her collection was growing. The county office was neutral and bland, filled with muted tones and carpeted silence. The clerk was kind, if a bit bored. She processed the request and promised to email a copy of the updated plot by the end of the day. Madison paid the fee without complaint. She didn't need justice. She needed paper. Official, traceable, enforceable paper. On the way home, she stopped at a local hardware store and bought a pair of security stickers, the kind people stick on windows to suggest an alarm system, even if none exists. It wasn't meant to fool Karen. It was meant to discourage any further movement. She also bought a small waterproof camera and mounted it near the edge of the porch roof, facing the tub. Nothing dramatic, just quiet surveillance. She didn't plan to livestream her conflict or expose Karen to the internet mob. She just wanted a record, something unarguable. Later, she found a folded note wedged into her screen door. Not taped, not pinned. Wedged, as if it had been slipped in by someone who knew she might not be home. It was written in sharp penmanship on pink stationery with a light rose border. The message was short. "A few of us are disappointed. This place was always meant to be shared. Please reconsider your tone. You're disrupting the flow of things." There was no signature. Madison read it twice, then placed it beside the sign in her drawer. She wasn't interested in tone. She was interested in fact. That night, something scraped against the side of the house. Not loud, but low and deliberate, like someone dragging a stick along the siding. Madison stood by the window, lights off, watching for movement. Nothing. No figures, no footsteps. Just the wind through the trees and the quiet hum of her neighbor's air conditioning units kicking on. When she checked the siding the next morning, she found no damage, no marks. But one of the patio chairs had been moved. Not far, just a few feet to the left. Enough to sit directly in front of the camera. Enough to block the lens. Madison didn't confront Karen. She didn't yell over fences or post flyers. Instead, she typed up a formal complaint and hand-delivered it to the nearest satellite office that handled local mediation requests. She included photos, dates, and a short timeline. Her request was clear. "I am not seeking punitive action. I am requesting enforcement of property boundaries and assistance in preventing further unwanted encroachment." She didn't accuse. She documented. That distinction mattered to her. She didn't want to be dismissed as emotional. She wanted to be understood as lawful. A week passed. The porch remained undisturbed for several days. Madison allowed herself to exhale, just slightly. She read a book on the swing. She returned to the hot tub once, cautiously, and found the water clean, untouched. She let her guard ease, not down, but aside. And then, just as easily, the piece unraveled. The chalk arc returned. Brighter, thicker, this time painted instead of drawn. Not on the sidewalk, but on the edge of the driveway, marking a boundary just shy of her car's tires. Alongside it, a fresh sign had been hammered into the grass. It wasn't laminated. It was wood. Painted white, stenciled red. "You are parked in a shared entry zone. Please respect access." Beneath the message was a number, a local one. Madison dialed it, her hand steady. A recorded voice answered. Female. Pleasant. "Thank you for contacting the Neighborhood Transition Committee. Your inquiry matters to us. Leave a message after the tone." Madison hung up. She filed another report. This one she sent directly to her attorney, marked with a single sentence. "It's not stopping. Please advise on next step." The reply came quickly. A formal cease and desist would be prepared. It would be hand-delivered, notarized, and followed by a certified letter. Madison approved it. She also added floodlights to the porch, not bright enough to disturb the neighbors, but strong enough to make loitering uncomfortable. That same evening, someone threw a water balloon over the fence. It burst harmlessly on the walkway, but the message was clear. She began noticing other neighbors behaving differently. One man avoided eye contact entirely, turning his face as he passed. Another woman, someone Madison had only waved to once, stopped in front of the house with her dog, bent down to tie a shoe that didn't appear to be untied, and remained crouched for too long. When Madison opened the front door, the woman stood quickly and walked away without a word. A few days later, someone left a basket on her porch with "Welcome to the Neighborhood" written in marker. It was filled with mismatched items: a half-used candle, an unopened jar of pickles, a brochure for reflexology, and a packet of tea past its expiration date. Madison didn't touch it. When the cease and desist was delivered, Karen smiled. She accepted the envelope without protest, thanked the courier, and waved cheerfully toward the house. Madison watched from behind the curtains. Karen didn't read it right away. She placed it on a chair, sat beside it, and sipped from a bottle of flavored water, as if it were a picnic, as if none of it mattered. Madison didn't expect immediate results, but she did expect space. The next day, the hot tub was filled with flower petals, rose, daisy, and eucalyptus, carefully scattered, floating like someone had prepared for a photo shoot. Madison drained it, cleaned it again, and sealed the cover with a chain. She didn't speak to Karen. She didn't yell, threaten, or appeal to reason. She installed another camera, this one hidden, and began logging every movement within 10 feet of the tub. She did not sleep with one eye open. She slept knowing everything was now being recorded. It wasn't peace, but it was a form of control, and that, for now, was enough. Madison didn't expect the city to move fast, but even she was surprised by how many departments claimed no knowledge of the issues she was documenting. The painted boundary line, the signs, the unauthorized use of her property, all of it somehow fell between the cracks of jurisdiction. Zoning sent her to neighborhood affairs, who redirected her to code compliance, who suggested she contact local law enforcement, who then explained that it was a civil matter unless someone was caught in the act of trespassing. She stood in line at one office for nearly an hour, only to be handed a printed flowchart that resembled a board game with no clear path to resolution. The only thing consistent across these conversations was the suggestion that she speak to the neighborhood liaison, a vague title tied to no specific name. When she finally found the right extension for that office, the woman who answered sounded genuinely overwhelmed, apologizing before Madison had finished explaining. "I don't know why this keeps happening on your street," she said. "We've had 2 other complaints about similar things recently, but nothing this organized. Frankly, it's strange. Let me make a note and escalate it." That was the first time Madison heard the word escalate from someone other than her attorney. Until then, it had been her private word, the silent classification she gave to each new intrusion. But now, someone else saw it too. That gave her a brief, bitter comfort. It didn't last. The cease and desist letter had clearly made its rounds. Karen hadn't just ignored it. She had reframed it. Neighbors who had previously been neutral now seemed performatively polite, over-articulating greetings, waving too enthusiastically from across the street, smiling too long, their faces blank as billboards. One woman left a bundle of lavender tied with twine on Madison's mailbox. Another dropped a folded card through the slot that simply read, "This community thrives on balance." There was no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Madison gave the security footage from the past week to her attorney, who passed it to a private mediation investigator. The footage showed what she already knew. Karen appeared regularly on the edge of the porch, never fully entering camera range, but always present long enough to be noticed. She would linger by the railing, adjust the porch chair, sometimes lean down and touch the planter boxes. Once she left behind a glass orb, decorative opaque blue, placed gently on the edge of the steps. Madison had found it and thrown it away without ceremony, but on the recording it looked ceremonial. Karen's movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Watching it unsettled Madison more than anything else so far. There was no hurry, no guilt, no attempt to conceal. It was like watching someone perform a blessing. Her attorney warned her that escalation might attract counteraction. That meant complaints, allegations, even performative legal threats designed to confuse the narrative. Madison had already prepared for this. She kept her property clean, up to code, every document in order. Her attorney filed a preliminary inquiry with the county record office requesting copies of any easements or informal community agreements tied to her parcel. The result came back clean. No easements, no shared use agreements, no overlapping claims. Her land was hers. On paper, it was undeniable. But the paper wasn't the problem. The problem was perception. And perception, in neighborhoods like this, often held more weight than facts. Karen, it seemed, had been laying groundwork for months, if not years. Madison learned from a city clerk that the so-called Neighborhood Transition Committee Karen referenced in her flyers wasn't officially registered, but did appear on multiple community newsletters. Not government publications, but local mailers, printed, folded, and distributed by hand. Madison got a copy. It was professionally formatted and filled with pseudo-civic language about restoring equilibrium to heritage zones and empowering inclusive spaces. One article, unsigned, referenced the difficulties of transitioning ownership after a death in the community, and emphasized the importance of honoring established local customs over paperwork formalities. Madison had no doubt who wrote it. She didn't respond. She didn't rebut publicly. She knew better. Engaging would validate it. Instead, she met with the mediation investigator and asked a simple question. If I take this to court, do I win? The woman looked her in the eye and said, Eventually, yes, but not before they make your life a different kind of miserable. That was the moment things truly shifted. Madison understood then that it wasn't just about removing Karen from her porch or stopping the flower petals or the unwanted signs. It was about cutting off the mechanism that allowed this campaign to persist. Karen wasn't acting alone. She might have been the face of it, the smiling woman in the bathrobe with the baked goods and friendly greetings, but there were others letting her move unchecked. Some silent, some cooperative, and some simply too indifferent to stop it. Madison realized that the only way to win wasn't to confront Karen directly, but to dismantle the system of non-interference around her, the passive shield of neighborhood silence that gave her power. To do that, Madison began gathering not just evidence, but context. She documented inconsistencies in how city services were applied to her property versus others, delays in sanitation pickups, a missed inspection tag for a back fence, subtle irregularities that, alone, meant nothing but together formed a pattern. She requested records, not complaints. She asked questions framed in bureaucracy, not emotion. Slowly, the paper trail grew. Her attorney advised her to sit tight, to let the foundation build. But Madison didn't wait quietly. She replaced the front fence entirely, adding a 6-foot privacy section along the porch that met every zoning requirement. She added lighting with motion detection and registered it with the city under residential security provisions. She sent certified copies of her property boundaries to the local neighborhood watch registry, even though she wasn't a member. She made herself visible in all the right places, not as a victim, not as a target, but as a property owner asserting legal normalcy. Karen noticed. Of course she did. She stood across the street one morning while Madison trimmed the hedge, just standing, no smile, no wave. And when Madison turned to meet her gaze, Karen finally blinked first. It was small, fleeting, but it registered. A signal. Not of surrender. Of recognition. Madison didn't smile. She simply returned to her work. The situation hadn't resolved, not yet. The signs hadn't vanished, and the chair still reappeared near the tub from time to time. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The balance had tilted. Karen might not retreat, but she now understood that Madison wasn't going to drift away or be softened into compromise. She wasn't temporary. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was watching, documenting, responding. And for the first time since the conflict began, Karen had nothing new to say. Madison believed she had shifted the momentum. The strategic fence extension, the paper trail, the quiet but firm legal positioning, all of it had made Karen back off, at least on the surface. For days, nothing happened. No signs, no symbolic gestures, no intrusions. Even the usual passive-aggressive tokens disappeared. The porch was quiet. The hot tub remained untouched. The mailbox was empty except for bills and the occasional catalog. Madison kept her routine. She maintained the cameras. She reinforced her gate and installed a discreet new lock system on the rear entry that only triggered electronically. She wasn't waiting for trouble, but she was ready for it. The lack of movement wasn't peace. It was silence before impact. And she was right. It started again with the noise, subtle, distant, then unmistakable. A hollow, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere near the rear wall. She stepped outside to find nothing at first, but later that day, while working in her study, the sound returned. So soft it could have been missed by anyone not listening for it. This time she followed it and found a series of smooth river stones placed deliberately along the base of the new fence. They weren't natural to the landscape. Too polished, too round, clearly purchased and positioned. 7 stones, each placed equidistant from the other, forming a kind of arc. There was nothing threatening about them at face value, but their precision gave her pause. It felt like another message, dressed in the language of neutrality. She didn't touch them. She took photos, cataloged the time, updated her folder. That same evening she heard movement again, this time near the front. Quick steps, then silence. When she opened the door, nothing was there except a string of hanging paper birds, cut from old book pages dangling from the porch light. They twirled gently in the breeze, fastened with twine. Someone had stood on her porch long enough to hang them, to measure the spacing, to tie the knots. She stepped out, cut the string with her garden scissors, and watched the paper shapes scatter across the lawn. She didn't speak. She didn't swear. She simply swept them up, stored them in a plastic bag, and marked the time again. The next wave wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. A formal notice taped to her fence. Clean, laminated, stamped with what appeared to be a public utility emblem. It read, "Assessment pending. Parcel use under Community Resource Review." There was a barcode, a case number, and a contact number. It looked real. Madison called immediately. The person on the other end was polite, confused, and eventually frustrated. There was no such assessment. The barcode was fake. The emblem was altered. The notice wasn't city-issued. When she asked if this constituted fraud, the clerk replied, "Possibly, but technically, unless it leads to actual loss, it's just misrepresentation." Madison thanked her, hung up, and filed another report. She attached the fake notice to her complaint with a statement from the utility office confirming its inauthenticity. Her attorney requested police acknowledgement, not enforcement, but acknowledgement. That distinction mattered. It meant the police wouldn't act, but would confirm in writing that they were aware of a pattern. That document would become crucial if Madison were ever forced to file a restraining order. Karen, meanwhile, returned to the background, not vanished, but retreated. She no longer came to the porch. She didn't cross the lawn. Instead, others began appearing. A woman with a stroller paused frequently by the curb. 2 teenage boys walked by daily, too slowly, their eyes scanning more than sightseeing required. A man in an oversized hoodie jogged past repeatedly, never sweating. None of them did anything overt. None trespassed. But their timing was always near dusk, always when the house lights flickered on, always when visibility was both highest and lowest. It was behavior designed to agitate without provoking. Madison began recognizing patterns, not of people, but of intention. She adjusted her camera angles. She turned the floodlights outward. She cut back the hedges that could be used as cover. When the flyer appeared, it wasn't addressed to her. It was folded into the community mailbox cluster on the corner. Madison collected it with her usual letters. It was printed on matte stock with soft pastel colors and a soothing font. Garden Calm. Collective retreat spaces and the ethics of access. There was no author, no organization name, only a reference to a home that once welcomed many now under unnatural restriction. There was an illustration, her porch, stylized, but unmistakably hers. The fence, the tub, the oak tree. It was surreal to see her property reduced to iconography. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was narrative warfare. Someone was trying to turn her home into a symbol. And symbols, she knew, attracted loyalty and backlash. The following day, she was served. Not sued, but petitioned. A community grievance form had been filed with the neighborhood board, an unofficial body that nevertheless held weight in matters of perception. The complaint accused her of aggressively individualistic behavior, withholding shared green resources, and creating psychological tension through over-monitoring. There were signatures, at least 12. Some familiar, some not. Madison brought the form to her attorney, who confirmed its lack of legal standing but added, "This is designed to provoke a mediated confrontation. If you ignore it, they'll escalate. If you answer it, they'll twist your words." Madison opted for transparency. She issued a response, not through the board, but publicly. She mailed a single letter to each signatory. The letter included a copy of her deed, her survey map, a notarized statement of her property rights, and a paragraph that read, "I respect your right to disagree with my choice to maintain my property as private. I also reserve the right to enforce that privacy through all legal means. You are welcome to your opinions. You are not welcome on my land." She signed each one by hand. She mailed them without emotion. She expected fallout, and she received it. Within days, her trash bins were knocked over repeatedly. Her back fence was tagged with chalk symbols, circles, arrows, abstract figures. Her porch plants were uprooted and placed, still whole, in a line across the lawn. She documented everything. She never retaliated. She simply reported. Each incident layered into the official timeline. Her attorney compiled it into a packet. Her mediation investigator submitted it to a private security consultant. Madison didn't install guards. She didn't weaponize her space. She simply ensured every entry point was accounted for and that every movement left a trace. Karen reappeared soon after, not with confrontation, but with charm. She arrived with a basket of lavender and lemon balm, claiming it was for stress relief. Madison didn't open the door. Karen left it on the steps and walked away, smiling at the camera without blinking. Madison disposed of it. She didn't need gifts. She needed distance, and for once she had it. Not safety, not resolution, but distance. And in this war of proximity, that was a win. Even if temporary, even if fragile. Madison had long since abandoned the idea that any part of this would resolve quietly. She'd entered the situation thinking it was an annoyance, a territorial nuisance caused by an overbearing neighbor with too much time and not enough boundaries. But now, every step she took revealed deeper layers of coordination, manipulation, and intentional misrepresentation that extended beyond Karen's porch visits or passive-aggressive notes. The boundary violations had evolved into something systemic, a campaign that was equal parts social engineering and psychological endurance test. The flyers, the signs, the silent observers, the co-opted language of community and shared space. It wasn't disorganized harassment, it was tactical pressure. And it had a goal, to exhaust her into compliance or departure. But what none of them seemed to grasp, what Karen especially failed to anticipate, was that Madison's resolve didn't break under pressure. It refined. It began again with something so minor it nearly escaped her attention. The side gate, the one she had triple secured and electronically monitored, triggered an alert but showed no breach. The footage revealed a small figure, barely in frame, holding something in their hands, an item that shimmered briefly under the motion light before being placed gently on the gravel beside the garden. Madison retrieved it in the morning. A ceramic object shaped like a house, hollow inside, painted in pastel tones, with the words, "Our space," etched across the roof. It was deliberately benign, harmless in appearance. But it wasn't left for her. It was a statement to someone else, a symbol placed within view of the cameras not to threaten, but to perform. It was theater now, and her property was the stage. That same week, she received a letter from the Office of Property Management. Not the city, but a private firm that had recently begun contracting with several neighborhoods for residential development facilitation. The letter stated that her address had been identified for possible inclusion in a proposed community reintegration zone, under a pilot program focused on urban-suburban unification and shared wellness initiatives. The language was carefully vague, thick with legal cushioning, but the subtext was unmistakable. They were trying to formalize what Karen and her cohorts had been informally imposing. It wasn't enforceable, not yet, but it was real. Official stationery, real letterhead, and contact numbers that rang through to real offices. Madison didn't call. She forwarded the letter to her attorney, who immediately recognized the name of the firm and explained that it had ties to a private landholding entity known for aggressively lobbying municipalities to blur property lines for green space. Integration. It was all voluntary, at least at first. But the programs came with heavy suggestion and thinly veiled coercion. This is how they do it, the attorney said. They build social expectation first, and when someone resists, they paint them as obstructionist. Eventually, enough pressure builds to justify administrative action. But you're not there yet. They're still in the soft phase. Madison responded the only way she knew how, by eliminating ambiguity. She filed a restrictive covenant on her parcel, through the county, publicly recorded and legally binding, that prohibited subdivision, reclassification, or shared access agreements without her explicit, notarized consent. It was an unusual move for a single residential plot, but it wasn't invalid. And it sent a signal, one that had to be acknowledged, not just ignored. Within 48 hours of filing, the notice on her fence disappeared. The surveillance stopped. The phone calls ended. It was quiet again, but not resolved. She knew a final test was coming. Karen had been too deeply invested, too careful in her moves, too brazen in her tactics to simply fade into the background without one last assertion of control. And when it came, it didn't look like a confrontation. It looked like a party. On a warm afternoon, Madison returned home to find folding tables set up along the curb, decorated with white tablecloths and vases filled with cut wildflowers. Soft, instrumental music played from a speaker. A banner stretched between two parked cars read, "Neighbors in Harmony, Celebrating Legacy Spaces." People milled about, some familiar, most not. Plates of finger food, lemonade in pitchers, kids laughing near the sidewalk. And then, past the hedge, past the new section of fencing, Karen. Seated in a lawn chair, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze aimed directly at Madison's house. She wasn't on the porch. She wasn't in the yard. But she was close. Close enough to blur the edge again. Madison didn't speak. She didn't walk over. She entered her house, closed the door, and made 3 calls. The first to her attorney, to confirm her rights. The second to the city's Land Use Coordination Desk, to report the unauthorized use of public right-of-way for private assembly. The third to her mediation investigator, who was already halfway to compiling a statement for permanent injunction. None of her actions were reactive. They were procedural, structured, planned. She didn't need to scream over the fence. She needed documentation. And this gathering, this celebration, was exactly the mistake Karen didn't realize she was making. What Karen had built until now was deniable, symbolic, light on paper, heavy on social weight. But this event was physical, coordinated, public, and in direct view of the property Karen had been encroaching on for weeks. The placement of the signs, the proximity of the chairs, the direction of the music speakers, all of it designed to establish ownership of tone, of story, of atmosphere. But it also made her vulnerable. Because now, Madison had dates, witnesses, and visual evidence of a campaign that had overstepped into physical territory. It wasn't just about paper birds and flower petals anymore. It was about occupation. She waited until dusk. When the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed and Karen began packing up the last of the folding chairs, Madison stepped outside. Not to confront, not to escalate, but to serve. The injunction was in her hands, approved, filed, signed by a judge who'd read every attached incident report, every complaint, every notarized statement. She walked calmly across her own lawn, stayed on her own side of the boundary, and handed the envelope across the hedge. Karen took it without a word, her smile a fraction slower, her eyes scanning the name on the header before looking back up. "This isn't about sharing," Madison said, her voice low and measured. "This is about you pretending you have the right to decide what's mine. You don't." Karen didn't answer. She simply looked away, back toward the now empty tables, the half-drained pitcher of lemonade, the fading echo of the music. Her hands tightened slightly on the envelope. Then she stood, brushed the back of her skirt, and left. Not quickly, not defeated, but deliberate, slow, retreating. Madison returned to her porch, locked the gate behind her, and sat. The sky darkened. The oak tree whispered overhead. The house, finally, felt like hers again. Not because the fence held, not because the court ruled, but because she had drawn the line, and held it. Not by screaming, not by matching madness with madness, but by method, by patience, by outlasting the performance with quiet permanence. Life on the street didn't change with drama or ceremony. There was no final confrontation, no public reckoning, no apologies offered or requested. Things simply stopped. Slowly, like a tide retreating without fanfare, leaving behind sand that looked almost the same but felt completely different beneath your feet. After the injunction was served, Karen didn't protest. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She didn't appear on Madison's porch again. Her car was parked farther down the road for a few days, and then one morning it wasn't there at all. No moving van. No farewell. Just an absence that widened with every passing day. The neighbors didn't speak of it. No one knocked to gossip or speculate. Those who had once nodded politely now glanced quickly and kept walking. A few still offered faint smiles, more out of habit than friendliness, as if trying to smooth over a collective memory everyone preferred not to acknowledge. Madison didn't feel triumphant. There was no rush of vindication, no celebratory moment where she stood tall over a vanquished enemy. What she felt instead was the slow return of something that had been missing for months. Quiet, not just around her house, but inside it. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean silence, but rather the absence of expectation, of watching, of waiting for someone to challenge what you know is yours. She went about her days without checking the cameras first thing in the morning. She no longer walked the perimeter of her fence every evening. Her hands stopped trembling when she heard unfamiliar footsteps on the sidewalk. The peace was not sudden or overwhelming. It was gradual, earned, and deeply internal. The porch reclaimed its identity. She returned the rocking chair to its place near the window. She re-hung the wind chime her uncle had made, letting it catch the breeze with its low wooden tone. She didn't immediately uncover the hot tub. It took time. The chain was removed first, then the cover was left slightly ajar. Finally, on a cool evening, she stepped into the water and let it hold her weight. Not because she felt safe, but because she no longer allowed fear to dictate how she lived in her own space. That, in the end, was the greatest shift. Not what Karen had done, but what Madison had reclaimed from within herself. A few weeks later, an official letter arrived from the city. It confirmed that all inquiries and petitions concerning her property had been resolved or dismissed. There were no further actions pending. Any future initiatives related to her lot would require her explicit approval. She pinned the letter behind the coat closet door, not as a trophy, but as a boundary etched into paper, undeniable and permanent. It was a quiet kind of victory. The kind that doesn't come with applause but with the soft exhale of a long-held breath. The neighborhood adjusted. There were no apologies. No one stopped to say, "You were right." But things shifted. The passive pressure lifted. The front path stayed clean. Packages stopped disappearing. Her mail was undisturbed. A neighbor's dog barked less when it passed her gate. She began planting again. Lavender, rosemary, small things that took root without asking for attention. She didn't wave to everyone, but she didn't flinch when someone did. One afternoon, she found a note in her mailbox. No name, no return address. Just a single sentence, written in blocky, uncertain handwriting. You broke the silence, but you brought the peace. She read it once, then tore it in half and tossed it away. Not out of anger, but because she didn't need the sentiment. She had lived the proof, and now, when she walked her own property, she no longer looked over her shoulder. She wasn't waiting for the next act. There wasn't one. The story had closed not with noise, but with clarity. Her space was hers. Not because she had claimed it, but because she had defended it. Not with confrontation, not with spectacle, but with law, logic, and a refusal to yield. Not to intimidation, not to narratives, and not to the illusion that silence was safer than resistance. That was the true ending. Not Karen's retreat, Madison's refusal to fade,